To Sounding Out. In this edition of the podcast, I'll be discussing the music of John McLeod, the, to quote music critic Norman Lebrecht, wondrously gifted Scottish composer who died 2 years ago at the age of 88. An Aberdonian by birth, John received his formal musical training at the Royal Academy of Music in London, where he studied composition with Lennox Berkeley. It was there that he met his wife of over 60 years, Margaret, an accomplished concert pianist and formidable musical personality in her own right, and who provided him with so much love, inspiration and support over his long career. I was privileged to get to know both of them when, in his mid-70s, John turned for the first time to writing for the guitar, producing a marvellous concerto and two wonderful and substantial solo works, one of which you can hear now. And if you're wondering why the guitar sounds so much like a piano, well, that's because it is. And the performer is the wonderful virtuoso Murray McLachlan, who also made the transcription, and who is this episode's special guest. A prolific recording artist with 40 critically acclaimed albums to his name, Murray was a close friend of John McLeod's, and we're going to hear excerpts from Murray's complete cycle of John's piano music throughout the podcast, and indeed links to all of the recordings heard in this episode can be found in the description box below. In addition to his highly distinguished concert career, Murray is a committed teacher and educator. He has written 3 books on piano technique, published by Faber, writes a quarterly column for International Piano magazine, one which has been running for 20 years, and is the founder and director of the famous Chetham's International Summer School for Pianists, the largest of its kind in Europe. And I'm delighted to be joined by Murray McLachlan now. Thanks, Murray, for agreeing to do this chat about John McLeod. We're recording just a few days shy of what would have been his 90th birthday, so I thought it would be good to do an episode on his music. I got to know John fairly, late in his life, when he was about 74, and he took to writing some guitar pieces, which he hadn't done before, and the pieces were fabulous, and it was a great privilege really for me to work so closely with him. But of course he was well acquainted with the piano for much longer, and of course his lovely wife Margaret, who died just about 6 months before him, was a wonderful pianist. So could you tell us how far back your association with John goes?
It actually started with the guitar as well, Ian, because I was more into guitar than piano originally, and I was playing in Aberdeen in the festival, and they have this trophy for the winner of all the classes, and it been gone to wonderful people in the past, like Kevin McRae, who was the cellist of the Scottish Chamber Orchestra, and Kevin Gowland, who became the principal flautist at the Birmingham. But anyway, for some reason, they gave it to a 13-year-old guitar player, which caused a bit of a scandal. But he was on the jury, and he said to me afterwards, he said, "You must learn the Rodrigo Concerto, and as soon as you do, let me know, and I'll conduct it with my school orchestra in Edinburgh." So that was my first offer of and then I got into the piano and never heard anything from him again until George Donald, the wonderful pianist and comedian and member of Scotland the What. I became friendly with him, and John, that was one of John's closest friends. And so we got together, and he gave me his first sonata. So this must have been, goodness me, I suppose about 1992, and I played the sonata and loved playing his sonata. I mean, it just feels so natural to do, and played it all over the place, memorized it, recorded it, did a recording of his music for Aberdeen University had a record label in the mid-90s. And then, the association continued. We did his concerto in London with the London School of Music Orchestra, him conducting me, and then recorded his complete piano music ultimately in 2017. And he was always there to speak to. So a great mentor, and Margaret too, great colleagues and mentors and friends, and musical father and mother figures, really.
Yeah, absolutely. That's wonderful and very interesting that it was the guitar. And of course, just at the start of this program, we heard you playing his Fantasy on Themes from Britain's Gloriana, which of course was originally a guitar piece, one of the guitar pieces he wrote in his 70s, and one which you made a fantastic transcription of for piano.
Well, he was very encouraging, and your terrific performances, inspired him no end. But yeah, I mean, what is it about his music that makes it so gripping and charismatic? Well, I mean, if you look at a photograph of John McLeod, he looks to me like Samuel Barber. He looks like the Scottish Samuel Barber. And there's a romantic streak in Barber's music. It's modern, but there's this intense romantic, and I think there was intense romanticism in John McLeod's music. Now, his great friend and colleague Ronald Stevenson, who was a little bit older, who admired John tremendously. They did concertos together. Ronald played the Grieg in Beethoven 3 with John conducting. But Ronald said, John always feels he's up against it. He feels he's got struggle as his leitmotif. And I think you can sense that struggle. I mean, there's a Scotch snap figure, ta-dam, that comes everywhere. It comes all over the place. But it's very heroic, and I mean, when one aspect of John McLeod is sort of a titanic, quasi Viking like god standing on a Nordic rock in the midst of a winter storm of the sea hitting him with a sword going whoa, that's very much part of it. And it ties up with that romantic neo-Samuel Barber. Now, he'd hate me saying this, and he did. He told me to stop it. Then he kind of accepted it after a while. And he said, well, Murray, what are the qualities of Scottish people? He said, it's all about anger and passion. Now, I think there is a bit of anger there. I would say it's more energy in the music. But my goodness me, there's passion as well. And, perhaps, he was greatly influenced by Lutosławski. That was one of his heroes. Lutosławski, synthesizes a lot. And even though he was radically modern and used chance techniques, there was a great synthesis and a great respect of tradition there as well. And I think that comes across, he's not the most trendy composer in the sense that he wrote 5 sonatas for piano. He still used old-fashioned forms. But within that discipline and traditional aesthetic, there's this intense curiosity, experimentation, energy, drive, romantic streak, struggle, anger, or whatever you want to call it, but certainly red hot passion. Because he's from Aberdeen, we don't tend to show our hearts on our sleeves on the East Coast as much as on the West Coast of Scotland. I'm an Aberdonian as well. And I think there's a sense of slightly containing it all. And certainly about Margaret as well. They wouldn't wear their hearts on their sleeves too much. My goodness me, he would hate me saying this. I'm sorry, John. I apologize, but I think it has to be said. He had a great sense of humor. He wrote wonderful short stories. His music is full of passion, but it's contained within this really quite disciplined structure, like a lid on a pressure cooker, if you like. So I don't know what you think about all that.
No, I mean, I think you are describing you perfectly what John once described as compositional fingerprints. I remember him using that phrase, and I remember when I in the early days of working with him, and we were doing the guitar concerto with a few orchestras in Scotland. And in the final concert, it was up in Aberdeen with the Sinfonietta, The second half was Sibelius 4. And for some reason, I've always sort of associated Sibelius with John ever since. And I think it's, well, firstly, John's fascination with kind of northernness, which comes
Yes.
in his music. I mean, Conrad Wilson called him a Nordic composer par excellence, which is lovely. But I think it's also the fact that Sibelius has such strong fingerprints of his own. I mean, you just need to hear a couple of bars and you know who it is. And John's music is very much like that. The fingerprints are exactly as you described, this intense energy and romanticism. And what you said about him being very much, I think consciously within the tradition. I mean, he never falls back into conventionality, but as you say, using traditional form, for example, we will get into how he pushed that a little bit later, and that's something that. I remember reading a review that Norman Lebrecht made of a recording of some of John's music with, I think it was the RSNO. In fact, I took the quote. There are rich rewards in John's music, not just in terms of oral satisfaction, but in the affirmation of a strong sense of musical continuity. I think very much part of John's makeup. But anyway, you mentioned the first sonata being a sort of early piece that you worked on with John. We're going to hear your recording of that just now, and that is from the complete cycle of John's piano music that you recorded.
That's right. I mean, I recorded it twice. We did all the works in the 1990s in Aberdeen University for Redbrook Records. On a Bosendorf from the Elphiston Hall in the university. And then we did it again in the Stoller Hall when there were more pieces and more sonatas in particular. And Rose, my daughter, played the Hebridean dances on that. So that was a double album. So yeah, the sonata based on the Liszt B minor sonata in terms of structure, but much more compressed, a one movement work and very sweeping with its orchestral gestures and monumentalism, definitely.
Very much so. Well, let's hear it now.
I mean, what you said about the Nordic spirit, of course, that one of his last major work was the viola concerto Nordic Fire, which has all of what we're talking about, and it was an amazingly exciting piece, very well received, very well reviewed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there are many other examples we could give. And later in the program, we'll have a listen to the Gokstad ship, which in his most performed piece of orchestral music. But before we get to that, you've described his music extremely well. In terms of musical influences, you touched on that, Lutosławski, this kind of northernness. He went to the Royal Academy of Music, firstly to study clarinet, but then he was accepted, or at least joined, Lennox Berkeley's class as a compositional student. Have you ever sensed much of Berkeley's musical style in John's music?
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, if you listen to the Four Impromptus, very early, that's the first major piano work that John wrote, and it was written in the 60s, just after the contact with Lennox Berkeley. There's that kind of light, tasteful, disciplined, neoclassical, French-inspired style. He also orchestrated it, and it's been played, by the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra and many others. But I think that's definitely an influence of Berkeley there, and I think the kind of discipline and the structure and the form and the economy of means must have been an influence of Berkeley. I mean, Shostakovich, another huge influence, and of course the Shostakovich connection, and the connection, the letters that John exchanged with Shostakovich. That's an important connection. But even Chopin, I mean, the 12 preludes of John McLeod, written in the same order as the Chopin preludes. It's not out of place, and I have done it, to play the Chopin 24 preludes in the same program as the John McLeod 12 preludes. It works extremely well. We talked about Liszt in the first sonata. Robert Carver, the old, composer from way back in Scotland, medieval times, his third piano sonata quotes, Robert Carver as its centerpiece. He was influenced, definitely. He wasn't averse to being influenced by Boulez and the avant-garde. And you can see that in the 3 protest pieces that are part of interludes for a song cycle he wrote for Jane Manning. And Lutosławski we've mentioned as well. I think Bartók is a huge influence. The kind of, going back to your Scottish roots, the Hebridean dances are in a sense a direct parallel to the Romanian dances of Bartók. Very much so. Film music, we shouldn't forget, Another Time, Another Place.
Yes.
And the influence of imagery and the populist element. I mean, if you listen to, the last prelude of the set of 12, it could be, I'm not trying to be, again, I can see him turning in his grave. Sorry, John. You could almost have a soundtrack for a sort of melancholic scene in Taggart or something. We've got another murder, sir, a murder, and then you would hear the 12th prelude. It could be a wistful moment in a very, but I think I'm not insulting the man at all, because it's the influence of imagery and film that would come in very much. If you listen to, I think the second prelude is very much the motoric influence of Prokofiev, of Suggestion Diabolique. He adored Stravinsky. So I think all these influences come there. I don't know if you can think of any more. Benjamin Britten, obviously, with the guitar. Yeah,
very much. I mean, actually, the thing that prompted that question was that when he composed the guitar concerto, in the first movement, I remember very strong hints of Berkeley. So, again, that kind of wistful neoclassical style, just creeping in. I mean, in amongst all of the stuff you spoke about earlier, that big Scotch snap thing that he does.
Yes,
so much. A wonderful, not quite an early piece, but an earlier piece of his that I've always loved is his Lieder der Jugend. So, I mean, obviously, we automatically think of Mahler with something like that. I mean, did he ever mention Mahler to you?
All the time, and remember he was conducting the SNO, and he did all these children's concerts for over 20 years. It may have been 25 years. I mean, and he was conducting was a great part of his life, and he obviously liked the romantic symphonies, and conducted, as I said, the Glasgow Chamber Orchestra, wasn't it, that he conducted, and with Ronald Stevenson and the Beethoven Third Concerto and the Grieg, so I'm sure the romantic tradition must have been a very important part of his life and comes into his music, unquestionably.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's the next thing we're going to hear. We're going to hear the third of his Lieder der Jugend, sung by Raymond Gilvan, and it's the Polish Radio and TV Symphony Orchestra of Krakow, conducted by John himself.
Morgen wollen wir ernten geschwind. Und als das Korn geerntet war, rief das Kind noch immer da.
Obviously, later throughout the 1980s, he got to know Evelyn Glennie, and he composed the percussion concerto for her. In that part of his career, which of his piano pieces stand out particularly?
That's interesting. I mean, he wrote the first sonata in the late 70s, and then the second one he wrote for Bryn Terry, who tragically died, and he withdrew it and then reproduced it just a few years before he died. The third sonata is not till the 1990s, so the preludes are kind of in the middle of the percussion. I think the percussion concerto was about 1987, and the preludes are 1984. So, but that's quite different, isn't it? And he was very busy doing all kinds of things, being a director of music, then being an examiner and running courses in London, jumping around all over the place. I mean, his percussion writing, he used to say to me, in darker moments, people think I only write for percussion, but Evelyn was an amazing evangelist for John. I mean, the Song of Dionysus, which is a piece for piano and percussion. I think she performed that something like 120 times. And recorded it. And, and he had a masterly way of writing percussion music. There's no question about it. That concerto in 5 movements, the Bartók influence, like the arch, is a masterpiece. And the stones, Kalinish in the middle, the stones of Kalinish influence that, very atmospheric and very Bartókian. But he just had this incredible knack of knowing how to write idiomatically and energetically and innovatively and naturally for percussion. And with Evelyn, it was tremendous. And then Colin Curry later on. I heard Colin years ago performing the Song of Dionysus. So it's fascinating, isn't it? I think the great tragedy for John as a composer, it really is horrible, is that he wanted desperately to write an opera about Rasputin, and it was accepted by Scottish Opera. It was going ahead, and then there was a change of administration, and it was dropped. And that would have been so wonderful, and it's such a loss that he didn't get to write an opera.
Yeah, it is. It is actually. I mean, I can just imagine how it might have. Well, we can all imagine what it might have sounded. It would have been wonderful. In this episode, we're not going to have time to listen to the percussion pieces for percussion that you mentioned, but I am going to link them in the description below. So, I mean, as many as I can find. So do if you're listening to this, do check them out. They are remarkable pieces. Our next piece, though, with our guest Murray playing, is John in what I thought of as a reflective mode, but Murray's corrected me that it's much more taggart.
Taggart reflective, or shall we say BBC soundtrack mode?
Yeah, BBC soundtrack mode.
Maybe film music mode. Wistful Scottish film, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the final prelude from his set of 12, Lento sostenuto. So, Murray, you wanted to speak a bit about John's woodwind music. He wrote prolifically for woodwind. He was himself a clarinetist. I think one of his early successes was his clarinet quintet. Just to let us know what we should be looking out for in that part of his.
Well, I mean, he was a pupil of Jack Brymer. He had lessons, and I mean that was his natural métier, and so he knew the instrument. And so, I mean, you know, there's all kinds of things that worth explaining. I mean, there's a transcription that Margaret made of 3 pieces from his film track, Another Time, Another Place film score, and that's beautiful and very easily accessible for clarinetists around grade 5, 6 level.
Really,
you know, and so that's worth exploring. The Clarinet Concerto is a major work. Now, Linda Merrick, who's the principal of the Royal London College of Music, wonderful clarinetist too, she recorded it with the college orchestra, but she's still keen to play it and still values it very highly. You know, and that's just the tip of an iceberg. The quintet you mentioned. There's also Le Tombeau de Ravel that he wrote for flute and piano, which beautiful work. You know, he understood wind instruments extremely well. He adjudicated wind instruments in festivals. You know, I don't think he played the clarinet so much in latter years, but you know, he was a clarinetist, skillful in the instrument, and that made him write very easily for woodwind. So wonderful works.
No, that's great. Lots to look out for and listen to there. As I mentioned in the introduction, one of the many things you do in your busy professional life is run the famous Chetham's piano festival and course. A few years ago, John gave a lecture on music and architecture at that course, which I'm going to link to again in the description box. This was a subject very dear to his heart. I mean, in his piano music, is this a fascination that is immediately evident in his approach to musical form and structure?
Absolutely. You only need to look at the first sonata. I mentioned the connection of the Liszt sonata, the 4 movements in one, but the third sonata takes that even further. It's even bigger and more denser with this Robert Carver quotation in the middle. And he was clearly very, very fascinated by structure and structures. I mean, the Gotthard ship, which we'll hear soon, it's in the form of the design of the plan of a ship, isn't it? Extraordinary thing to do. You know, and even the miniatures, the preludes, you know, they're always exquisitely crafted. He had a great sense of not writing any notes more than the number of notes required to say what he wanted to say. So yeah, microscopically and in terms of monumental pieces, you know, the planning out of the music was clearly really important and makes it very effective. One of the major strong points about his music.
Yes, I mean, he clearly valued that in the music of other composers, and he was able to observe the effect that a well-structured piece had on an audience. John was, clearly fascinated by northernness in general, something we've mentioned already. You've touched on what is specifically Scottish about his music. It's something he was clearly conscious of. Obviously quoting Carver. Is there anything else you could say about that?
Well, I think the one we're going to hear, the Hebridean Dances, is the most blatantly popular piece he wrote in many ways, extremely accessible and obviously designed as McBartok. And in that respect, he was following on the footsteps of his friend and colleague Ronald Stevenson, but also Eric Chisholm, who was a little bit older, who was also called McBartok as well and did the same thing. But this is very much popular but very well constructed music. I adore, by the way, the orchestral version as well. I would say the Scottishness is deeper. I would say that East Coast of Scotsmen are not as demonstrative on the surface as people from the West Coast. I would say that there's it's harder perhaps to get to know people, but once you do know them, the loyalty and the friendship is extremely strong. So I would say that inner anger and passion comes out, and that's very Scottish.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Murray, for agreeing to do this interview. Your insights are wonderful. I don't think I could have spoken to anyone who could have given better and more accurate insights into the music of.
Oh, thank you. A great pleasure, and your wonderful performances, John. Appreciated a lot.
Well, it's very, very kind of you to say so, and it's very nice to know that. As you mentioned, we're going to hear the final two Hebridean dances, the Bara Love Lilt and the Cockle Gatherer. These are not played by you, I'm afraid.
No, this is Rose. Yeah.
Yes. Just tell us a little bit about the performer.
Rose, well, this is my daughter, but this is when she was about 17, and she's now 23 and at postgrad at the Guildhall. But she was still at Cheetham School of Music, and she played these a lot and enjoyed them very much. Okay, thanks so much, Ian.
It's a wonderful recording, and that's what we're going to hear now.